Jake.
I'm Tom.
We are Velocities of Music. On this podcast, Tom and I discuss a canteen of topics pertaining to modern music, including artist deep dives, genre deep dives, and monthly and new music wrap-ups. Awkward pause there. Genre deep dives. That may be what we're finally here to do today, Tom.
Yes.
Finally here. We've been talking about this for months. It is time to do a deep dive into the genre of post-rock.
We've been preparing for months, too.
Yeah.
This one's been pretty grueling.
It's been grueling. It's actually been tougher than I thought. But before we get started, you can help support Velocities of Music. Subscribe to Velocities of Music on your favorite podcasting device to automatically get our latest podcast episodes sent to your device each week. Also, Velocities of Music doesn't want your money. We also don't want to introduce ads into the podcast yet. Right now, all we want is for you to share Velocities of Music with family or friends whom you think would benefit from joining in on the music discussion that Tom and I attempt to create whenever we make a podcast. So, post-rock. We started talking about this a couple months ago. Post-rock is, we're going to define the genre. I think that's like the first thing that we have to do in this podcast to really set the stage for it. But to go, it goes without saying that post-rock is really one of our favorite genres of music right now. And I think it has been for a number of years. I first discovered post-rock in 2009 when I just randomly happened upon some Explosions in the Sky records. And then I know that you were into Saxon Shore at the time. And so I remember you and I just starting to trade. Like, we just discovered, it was like we opened this like treasure chest that we had found at the bottom of the sea. And it's like, here's this just new treasure trove of music. And it was fantastic, right? It really, really spoke to us. But why? What made it something that you and I latched onto so early on, Tom? What is post-rock, and why is it appealing to people like you and I?
Sure. Well, I think that inevitably, from the beginning, one of the reasons that it appealed to us, that we gravitated towards it, is because when you think about it, you and I, especially in the context of our hipster college years, Jake.
What?
We
sorry.
were
hipsters?
Sorry, but did you not know that yet? Did I break that too soon?
I feel like it was like bro hipster.
Yeah, kinda.
Yeah,
but
I feel like I've gotten more hipster as I've gotten older.
That might be true.
Am I still bro hipster?
I don't think so.
Am I still a bro?
You might
God
be.
Damn it!
You can't just graduate from bro status.
I really want to, though.
It takes years of kicking against that system.
I've been kicking pretty hard. I want to shoot myself right now.
It's all right. So anyway, we'll try not to reflect too specifically then, because it might just depress us. But in all honesty, thinking back to how we were in college, I mean, we're trying to discover new music. I think that we found, a genre that really spoke to us in the sense that we were looking for things off the beaten path, and we were looking for music that was made for the sake of music. And I think that's something that you can inarguably say about post-rock, is that there are no post-rock bands out there making post-rock for the girls and the fame and the glory. They're doing it for the love of music. They're doing it for the art, because naturally there are just some things going against this genre that I think, at least in today's world, I think it would take some serious musical shifts that I would love to see this move to the mainstream, but I just don't think it's going to happen.
Right. It inevitably, when you say what is post-rock, the things that come to my mind, the first thing is no vocals, which isn't always true. We're going to dive into that.
Yeah.
But the first thing that comes to my mind is it's instrumental-based rock music that airs on the side of progressive rock.
Yes.
That to me, it has had a very high level what I think of when I think of post-rock. And that's not even true, because the first example you get is Sigur Rós.
Sure.
And they immediately have vocals.
Yeah, they do.
So it's kind of a touchy subject, and I think that as we go through, later on in this podcast, we're going to go through the timeline of post rock at a high level. It's no way in an hour-long podcast we could ever like thoroughly go through every post rock album.
Right.
But at a high level, we'll go through what albums really shaped post-rock and some of those, and we'll talk about like some of the influences that were there. And a lot of those bands started off with vocals.
Yeah.
With vocalists that provided, the voice became an instrument in part of the mix. But the thing to me that is always there is that progressive instrumentation.
Yes, absolutely.
In that style of songwriting, normally you don't have post-rock albums that just have a ton of tracks on them. Normally it's a little bit, there's just fewer tracks on the album, and the tracks are a little bit longer because of the progressive nature of the song structure and the song writing.
Yep.
These tracks are kind of sprawling. They're going all over the place. You see a lot of big dynamic contrast in post-rock albums. And that's not always true, because some post-rock is a little bit more experimental. I think there's a lot of similarities between ambient music and sometimes even like house music.
Oh yeah, for sure.
You know, with but more instrumental based. There's not usually not a lot of electronic elements in post-rock, but that's not always true, because as time has progressed, you've seen more and more of even well-established post-rock acts starting to incorporate more electronic elements into post-rock, and honestly, to some great effect.
Yeah.
Sometimes it works really well, but that's kind of the beauty of post-rock, is that it has this, you know, very dynamic, very progressive structuring, but it's so fluid and so flexible in how the sound can be presented, that every album has a chance to really add something unique, its own unique spin or flavor to the genre. So it makes it incredibly hard to define and describe, but yet, you know, it's kind of like pornography. You know it when you see it or hear it, for that matter.
So you make a great point, because I think we're looking at several variables that help define what this genre is. We talked about no vocals. That's a big part of it. I think some other things about post-rock, though, comes more at the output rather than the input. To me, what makes post-rock feel like post-rock to me is an emphasis on using guitars for mood and atmosphere rather than melody. Yes. And that's not going to always be the case, but even not just the guitar part of it, but overall, are you going for a kind of mood or an atmosphere, or are you trying to be more melodic? I feel like post-rock tends to be more atmospheric. So naturally, there's going to be a lot of different ways of getting to that atmospheric destination. People use different instrumental palettes and so on. But, you know, there's a lot of variables that play into it. And to me, I think you can have a band considered post-rock with maybe just a couple of those main variables, but because of that, you're going to have bands that are considered post-rock that really don't sound anything alike. And I think that we see that with some of the bands we're going to talk about, you know, jumping ahead a little bit. We'll get into more detail about this, but like, Jake, you know, what do bands like Don Caballero and Sigur Rós really have in common?
Right.
You know, I think that's a challenging question, because really, you know, Sigur Rós has vocals, Don Caballero doesn't.
They both play music.
Right. They're both rock bands. But you know, what makes them both post-rock? Well, I think they both have multiple variables that overall we would consider to define post-rock, but if you put them both on a Venn diagram, I don't think there's a whole lot in the center of that.
Right.
There are some other bands that they both have in common, and there's that shared kind of middle ground, maybe with other comparisons, but I think that's where this definition becomes a little bit problematic, because there are just so many things to take into account, and it's so open-ended.
So, Needy, what is the typical instrumental composition of a post-rock album?
Sure. I think at a foundation, typically you still got guitar, bass, and drums. That's the rock part of post-rock.
And,
right?
And typically, in the post-rock that I've listened to, post-rock always seems to have that.
Yeah.
In some form or another. How those instruments are expressed changes drastically from band to band. And even from album to album within a band's discography, it can change drastically. But you always seem to have electric guitar, usually multiple layers of electric guitars.
A lot of effects.
Bass and drums. Now, a lot of times, you know, usually the drums are full acoustic drums. Usually it's a full set, very, very loud sounding drums. You rarely get a lot of electronic beats in post-rock. Although newer, some of the more recent artists are certainly starting to infuse electronic beats
right,
into
it's still supplemental.
Yes,
it's not necessarily the main part.
And you always have, you know, that layering of electric guitars. Probably one of the reasons why I was initially attracted to post-rock is the emotional context that's in every single post-rock album. Most post-rock And this probably goes into why these artists are creating, as you kind of led off with in this podcast, Tom. You said, there's no post-rock. It's kind of alluring because there's no post-rock band who's doing this to make fame, to get famous, to get girls or anything like that. Like, they're in it for the music, and therefore there usually is some emotion driving them. Yeah. And they capture that emotion really well, and that's what I think is a very appealing thing. You couple that emotional conveyance with a lot of the just typical, sonic composition of post-rock bands, a lot of the layered guitars. It's honestly, it has similarities to some Radiohead albums I've heard, and so it kind of was a natural fit for me. Now, we got to dive into vocals really quick.
Sure.
Before we jump to the timeline, I want to talk through vocals, because I got to say there's a number of bands that we're going to talk about here in a bit that have a vocalist and are contributing vocals, sometimes even with lyrics and vocal hooks and everything, that are considered post-rock. But a lot of bands don't have any vocals, and that's also considered post-rock, and I think that's what post-rock is known for, but that doesn't make any sense. It doesn't seem consistent. Tell me, Tom, make sense of this for me.
Sure. Well, I will certainly try. So this, I think, also relates back, the vocals piece relates back to what you said, Jake, about the emotional appeal and the emotional resonance that artists are going for in post-rock, because I think that one thing that's the mark of a bad rock band to me is when they're relying on the vocals and the lyrics for the entire message. The vocals should not bear the sole burden of conveying a message or an emotion. If you're relying on your lyrics to do that, then you must not be doing anything interesting instrumentally. The lyrics should be there to support that, or in some creative choices, even contrast that if you're going for a specific kind of satire or something like that. But really the role that vocals play is very unique in music in general, and I think that sometimes people put too much focus on it and don't let the instrumental shine. And that's one thing I love about post-rock, is it's all about letting the instrumental shine, right? Yeah. So they can when you can achieve an emotional resonance without the use of lyrics and words being connotated with the music that you're making, which in post-rock you usually only get in album titles and song titles, unless you're Sigur Rós and in the early 2000s even want to shed that as a word association.
Sure, right.
But typically that's what I think is interesting about post-rock albums without vocals, is I read the song titles and they bear so much more weight as to providing a context.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
But it's impressive to me when you can really move me without needing vocals, when you're letting the instruments speak for the sound, and I think that's really powerful. But when it comes to the role that vocals do play in post-rock that has vocals, what's funny is it still goes along with that, because they're almost used as just another instrument.
Yes, and that I think is a key point, is that typically if post-rock bands have vocals, the vocals are used as an instrument.
Yeah.
They're either adding texture, adding that contrast you were talking about, providing a different perspective, but it's always in conjunction with the other sonic elements that are being presented to you at once.
Right.
Whereas like within typical rock or pop music, the vocals are usually front and center and are the central point of the deliverance of that music, right? That they're the conduit of which you first connect, or designed to connect to the music.
Yeah.
It's what gives it the human aspect, I guess. And so post-rock is all about being human without that human connection.
Yeah,
it's a different sort of music, and I think that is what makes it so alluring.
It turns the tables, because what's typically the star of the show becomes the supporting cast, and vice versa. So it kind of flips that dichotomy around.
Random question, because if you look this up if you look up post-rock on Wikipedia, it says that post-rock is a subgenre of rock and roll. How do you feel about? Is this a subgenre?
We're getting philosophical now.
Yeah,
I think I don't know if subgenre. I feel like subgenre has I think that has a connotation that I don't agree with, because I think that almost sees it as like a parent-child relationship, and I don't see it that way. I see it as an evolution and an offshoot, but
kingdom phylum.
There you go. But the hierarchy, I think that when you look at something as a subgenre, there's kind of a temporal association that you make with it existing at the same time as. Whereas I see this as an evolution. I see it as an offshoot where the pilgrims of rock, so to speak, branched off and formed their own colony of post-rock, and that developed its whole own thing, you know?
Right. It's a separate evolutionary path.
Right. Yes, that is a much more succinct way of putting what I've been babbling about for the last minute or so. So yes.
Well, we've had a lot of practice trying to consolidate each other's thoughts. So
right, true.
This is what we do, Tom.
Yes.
This is what we do. Okay, where did post-rock come from? What are the genre origins or subgenre origins, depending on which, school of temporal thought you come from?
Sure. And that's why I don't see this as a subgenre, because I think to say this is a subgenre of rock is to say that its only parent is rock, and that rock is some asexual being that gave birth to the genre of post-rock.
Yes,
that is not true.
No,
there are many other things that played into this, like krautrock. A lot of krautrock from the late 60s and all the way through the 70s, bands like Neu!, Faust, Kraftwerk, Can. All these bands, I think the characteristic that post-rock pulls from them is they were great about creating a mood without vocals. Bam, there you go. Now, the energy was very different. A lot of times it was more entrancing and hypnotic, almost pulled from some kind of like polyrhythmic, even like Afrobeat tradition, but just done in a much more European and much more electronic and kind of insular way. And I think that's what's really interesting about krautrock. Now, some of the characteristics that they share there also is krautrock has the long, sprawling track lengths. Yeah. And the songs develop very slowly. There's a lot of subtlety, but it's the instrumental focus where, once again, if there are vocals, like in bands like Can and every now and then Kraftwerk, which borderlines more on electronica and early electronic music, they still play that supporting role. They're not the main focus. They're meant to provide an energy and an intensity and support that mood rather than tell a story or give any kind of like lyrical depth. Of course, there are going to be exceptions to that sometimes. It also similarly pulls some of that energy from post-punk. Bands like Public Image Limited, even you have some more offbeat ones like, I don't know if you would call like Young Marble Giants post-rock necessarily, but like This Heat, you get into the early 80s and there's some stuff like that. Where they're taking some of these developmental aspects of krautrock, but they're infusing it with a punk spirit. Sure. They're making it more energetic. They're making it more rebellious. And I think that grading aspect in the guitars is something that we'll see in post-rock a lot. From there, then, I think you mentioned prog rock. You look at bands like Pink Floyd, King Crimson, Rush, Yes. All these bands were putting out these really tightly crafted, like 5 or 6 track albums, and doing a lot of instrumental work too. I mean, all the bands that I mentioned had vocalists, but there were a lot of highlight moments on all of their albums where the instrumentals were just taking it away. Think Pink Floyd, It's Animals.
Yep. Big dynamic shifts in the songwriting as well.
Absolutely. Early King Crimson was doing that all the time. Yes, maybe had a little bit more of the vocals, but they brought in a more orchestral and grandiose presentation to it that you definitely hear in post-rock. Right. So there's that aspect to it too. I also hear a lot of shoegaze from late 80s, early 90s bands like My Bloody Valentine, Slow Dive, Ride, where the aspect that I feel like is taken from that is all the effect layers on the guitars. You listen to My Bloody Valentine and just all the frickin' reverb and distortion and distorted reverb and reverb distortion that's all just compounding up in the mix. And it creates this beautiful cacophony that post-rock pulls all the time when you listen to bands like Godspeed and Set Fire to Flame and stuff like that. The more kind of intense stuff that's more effects driven. Explosions in the Sky definitely does that as well. There's a lot of that. There are also just some more experimental artists and composers like Steve Reich and Brian Eno that really I think had a say in that as well. Even like David Bowie, for God's sakes. I mean, you listen to like the last half of his 1977 album Low, and that, for all practical purposes, you could almost consider pre-post-rock.
Yeah, for sure.
I mean, there's so many different sources to this that I think these bands are pulling from. It really becomes a beast of its own, because I don't think it really adopts a majority of its sound from any one of these things, but it's pulling a little bit from so many different sources that it ends up to be a really unique kind of genre. And I think that's also why there's so much variety within the post-rock genre itself, to the point that we can take two post-rock bands and say, these don't even really necessarily sound like each other. And maybe where they evolved to, they don't, but they probably have similar origins that they're just pulling from their sources with different ratios and different inspirations and things like that.
That's a really nice way of putting how I kind of visualize in my mind how these post-rock bands, assuming that they're all just sitting around planning out their sound, which of course none of them do, right? Like
just kind of gets there.
Yeah, they just start playing and they go, oh yeah, that's they kind of build their own identity as they're writing the music, right? So as we were preparing for this, Tom, we did the ultimate nerdy music geek thing, which is you had to make a spreadsheet.
Oh yeah, spreadsheets abound.
With, a chronological list of all these albums that are within the post-rock genre and list them by release date. So that was a blast. And from digging into this, I quickly noticed that there was, I could really see three very distinct eras of post-rock.
Sure.
Just within, I'd say like the volume of releases, starting with the early years, and how post-rock formed, but then like right in the middle, from like 1999 throughout the early 2000s to like 2004, 2005, you just have this glut of post-rock albums. Just a ton of post-rock was released in that 5-ish year time frame, and a lot of very, very high quality genre defining post-rock albums were released in that very short time frame. And then everything since then, those kind of like middle golden years of post-rock, kind of 2006 on, what I would define as kind of the modern post-rock era. A lot of my favorite post-rock albums are from the modern era of post-rock, or the most recent years. Simply because that's what I've been exposed to the most, right? I didn't grow up with those other albums because post-rock was relatively unknown. I mean, I feel like, in just a general disclaimer, we talked about this before we started recording, but we're going to jump around a lot here. We kind of have to, because you can't follow this timeline without jumping into other comparisons and other, tangents that I think just have to be flushed out, right? But I think that one thing that really catches my mind when I think about post-rock and going through the timeline with you, Tom, is I think that there's like a definite point in post-rock's history where it became a more popular genre.
Yeah.
Post-rock, even, we did a grunge deep dive a long time ago, and grunge music, like a couple of years in, just kind of took off, and it was the biggest thing ever.
And you could draw a pretty hard line in like late 1991 as to when it got big.
Post-rock has never really been big, but it's bigger now than it ever was. And I don't necessarily know why that. I don't think post-rock really ever can be big. We'll talk about more about that later. But I feel like it has risen in prominence to where most music nerds, enthusiasts have heard of post-rock, probably have a few favorite post-rock bands that they go to all the time. I certainly did before preparing this podcast, and this podcast has exposed me to a lot a greater number of artists I didn't even know existed, right? So, without further ado, you want to just jump into the early years of post-rock?
Let's do it, yeah.
So back in our album reviewing days, we got a request to review one of the founding albums of post-rock, and that was Slint's Spiderland, which I had never heard prior to that review.
Yeah.
And I remember loving that album as we went and reviewed it. It was very visceral is not the right word, but it's very kind of it's an austere sort of listen, right? Like you feel very it's sparse in its sound, yet it's kind of ominous and dark
kind of
sounding,
sinister,
and it has vocals. And the vocalist, his role in that album, I felt, was to deliver that sinister feeling throughout the record.
A lot of spoken word, a lot of narration.
Absolutely.
Now that album does kick against one trend that I mentioned, which is that post-rock tends to have not really much in terms of lyrical focus. Absolutely not the case on Spiderland.
Nope.
Because Spiderland, they're great lyrics, and the story that he's telling in these songs is really important to the mood that they're creating with the instrumentals as well. So that is an important part of it. Now, I will say, I think we tend to be more lenient, and by we, I don't just mean me and you, Jake. I mean the entire music community, music listeners, music enthusiasts. I think we as a collective tend to be more lenient when we define early progenitors of a genre.
Yeah.
And that's absolutely the case with Spiderland. I think that if Spiderland came out today, people would hesitate to call it post-rock in today's standards.
I think it's closer to post-punk.
Right. Yeah, or post-hardcore.
Absolutely.
Just in the same way that if AC/DC came out today, we probably wouldn't call it metal, right?
Sure. The only thing about Spiderland we would agree on is that it's post-something.
Post-something. It's not just rock. In the context of 1991, it was not just rock.
Yeah, in the context of 2016, it's not just
still
rock.
Yes, and that has remained true for sure. But I think one thing, too, is we have to identify some of the more specific elements of this album, because talking about it as a whole, as a big picture, you could say, yeah, it's not really post-rock by today's standards, but I think even by today's standards, if you pull like the instrumental track For Dinner, that would absolutely be considered post-rock.
Absolutely.
No vocals,
Yep.
The role that all the instrumentals play, and then you have the absolutely gorgeous guitar of Washer.
I know it's dark outside.
And even the songs that have vocals on this album, like you said, Jake, the vocals are sparse. The role that they're playing, even if it is strong lyrically, it's not dominating the instrumentals. The instrumentals are still taking a lot of the highlight. So Spiderland, for that reason, I think was a huge influence on future post-rock and just developing the genre as a whole.
So, Tom, from your perspective, what were some of the other early post-rock records? Kind of in the, Spiderland was March of 1991. So
Sure.
We're in the early 90s here. That's when a lot of these what are now considered the seminal albums of post-rock were released in the first few years of the 1990s.
Sure.
What were some of the other ones that you'd like to note here?
I think another group that comes up a lot, and deservedly so, is Talk Talk, who are actually a kind of synth pop band of the early and mid 80s. In the late 80s, they started getting more experimental. They had a couple albums, one called Spirit of Eden and one in 1991 called Laughing Stock, that were just fantastic. And we see them go towards using guitar more for atmosphere, so one key component there. There are vocals, but they're much more sparse. They're not dominating the sound. But those two albums have a bit of a jazzier feel. And actually, Jake, how did I not mention jazz when I talked about post-rock influences? God.
Loaded with jazz influences.
Absolutely. And Talk Talk was a good example of that. We're also going to see that later on with groups like Tortoise. Definitely incorporate a lot of jazz later on in their sound, and some others as well. But Talk Talk was a big influence on that, especially when you consider where they came from and the fact that they had a more 80s pop sound and then developed into that. That's one of those moves where, as we said about Radiohead, when you can pull the mainstream with you and get people listening to something new that you've done that they might not have listened to had it been by some other Joe Schmo band that they'd never heard of, that has a powerful impact. And I think that that's something that Talk Talk started to do. I don't think that it was as high profile as some other bands we've seen that have pulled that off, but it's anytime a band really switches genres to a genre that in all reality is less mainstream than what they were already doing, then they're poising themselves to make that kind of impact. In the early 90s, though, we also saw, some other bands that once again, I don't think they were getting together saying, let's make a post-rock album, because it hadn't really been labeled, it hadn't really been defined. But we did see Cul-de-sac, who I had never heard of before preparing this podcast, Jake. And I think they're fantastic.
ECIM?
Which is mice backwards. I don't know if there's some other way of pronouncing that.
I did not connect that
really?
until just now.
I don't know if it matters or not, but that album came out in 1991, and I found that to be incredibly forward-thinking for its time. You can tell, once again, it's not setting out to be anything in particular. It's not setting out to be post-rock, but it could certainly be classified as such in hindsight. It's using a lot of fiddle even as an extra kind of instrument. It's got really open, spacious production, gives it a unique kind of country edge, but it's chock full of these noisy electronic bits as well, and the way that they're using guitar is just really impressive.
In 1993, you had Don Caballero's For Respect, which that I had never heard of Don Caballero before. That For Respect, I think, really caught me off guard. For one thing, I loved listening to it just because it's such a hectic assault
crazy.
of a sound. It honestly, it sounds nothing like post-rock to me. It's probably a forerunner of post-metal, which we'll talk about that genre later in this podcast, but it really is visceral and intense in a way that most post-rock just typically isn't.
Yeah.
But still, you can understand why it got classified as post-rock with how the artist was presenting the sound.
To me, it's like post-hardcore that just happens to not have vocals.
Definitely.
You can hear a lot of these kinds of sounds in more modern bands like the Mars Volta, who of course also pull a lot of prog as well at the drive-in. I mean, the guitarist Ian Williams from Don Caballero went on to create Battles. And you can hear a ton of that sound in Battles.
Yeah,
I mean,
absolutely.
he's certainly carrying that on with that project as well. But once again, as early as 1993, and Don Caballero, when they were first forming, they were actually looking for a vocalist. They didn't intend on having this be what it was, but they started doing some shows anyway and found that people were really digging what they were doing, and they thought, well, hell, if we don't need a vocalist, let's just keep writing like this.
I feel like more bands should do that.
I feel like that too, because look at what it opened Don Caballero up to. Could their drummer have played in a band where a vocalist was trying to steal the show?
Right.
No. And the open-ended structures and evolutions of their songs are just mind-blowing. And For Respect is a great starter of that. We're going to see a few more albums of theirs come out in the 90s. They had Don Caballero 2 in 1995, and so on. So they really stuck with it through the 90s, and they made a lot of great albums. But also in 1994, we have a couple of other key albums with Bark Psychosis' Hex.
We actually reviewed that one back in the day.
And that was the first album to be labeled as post-rock.
Yep. And understandable as to why.
Absolutely. And that one has a lot of jazzy elements to it as well. Sparse vocals. Sounds a little bit more like Talk Talk and kind of the early stuff that we were talking about.
So satisfied, leave without betrays.
But then also you had Tortoise's debut self-titled album. And Tortoise will end up being a huge inspiration in the post-rock genre. A lot of people referred to post-rock as it kind of started to develop around that time as the Tortoise sound. Well, now today with the internet and more easy historical insight into these things, we can see what was going on before then that we could consider post-rock. But at the time, if Tortoise was what you'd heard of that was your reference point, right? Like that was what you compared everything else to.
Well, and Tortoise is still active today, right?
Right.
So since the mid 1990s, in the early formative years of post rock, these guys have been releasing a sound that has releasing albums with the sound that defines what post rock is. So if the genre belongs to any band, it has to be Tortoise, even though they weren't like the band that really made the defining albums, the albums that really cemented it as a genre and made it I don't want to say the big thing it is today, because I still feel like a lot of people just don't know about post rock, which is a darn shame.
In 1996, early 1996, Tortoise put out their second album, Millions Now Living Will Never Die. A lot of folks see...
Do they know that what is dead may never die?
What?
You don't watch Game of Thrones. You
No, I
don't
don't.
know. Tom.
You can't throw... We were just talking about this. You can't throw Game of Thrones references in here. It's going to go over my head, man.
That's sad.
Just don't tell me who dies, even though I know everyone dies.
But like now everyone listening to this is going to spoil it for you because they're going to tell you who dies.
They'll probably just make up stuff. They'll be like, man, Ronald Reagan dies in the first season. And it'll be like, damn, you got me.
Good old Eddard Reagan.
That's right. So anyway, Millions Now Living Will Never Die. Really important album, and a lot of folks consider that to be the keystone of post-rock in the mid-90s. And a lot of folks consider it to be Tortoise's magnum opus. I would actually agree with that. I think
that's a great record.
My personal favorite of theirs is TNT, which will come out a couple years later in 1998 or so. But Millions Now Living Will Never Die is an interesting album because it starts with this song called DJ'd, which is like this 20-plus minute long epic track, and then there are just a handful of shorter tracks after that. So the album structure there we're seeing even be much more ballsy than its predecessors. I do love Millions Now Living Will Never Die, but for, like I said, for me, I would actually put their self-titled debut as well as TNT a little bit over it. I think that in this era, in this like 1995 to kind of 1998 era, we saw a lot of bands start to develop that hadn't really quite settled on their sound yet. Mm-hmm. Tortoise was a little bit ahead of the game because they'd been around. You know, you had Cul-de-sac, which didn't really, even reach the level of acclaim that Tortoise did. You had a band called Rachel's, which I had never heard of before preparing for this podcast, and they had an album in 1996 called The Sea and the Bells. They had another one a few years later called Selenography, and I was actually a big fan of Selenography. And
see, I really like The Sea and the Bells.
Really?
Yeah.
See, but I think that Selenography, they're both good albums, but I think that Selenography is much more post-rock. This was one that I put on, and I'm like, would I define this as post-rock? Because it's really more orchestral.
Yeah. The Sea and the Bells is more chamber music than anything else, right?
Mm-hmm. I would totally agree with that. I think that in Selenography, they start to incorporate more atmosphere in the guitars, which is, really part and parcel with what was happening in 1999 when that album came out.
Right.
That's when we saw this genre start to progress a little bit more. But definitely an interesting band to check out if you hadn't heard of them. Also in this era is where we saw Godspeed You Black Emperors debut, F sharp, A sharp, Infinity.
Sigur Rós.
Yeah, we saw Sigur Rós' debut, Vaughn. We saw Mogwai's debut, Young Team. That was, those all came out right around 1997. And I don't think that any of those are necessarily defining works. I will say Mogwai's Young Team is probably my favorite album of theirs. But they changed their sound quite a bit after it came out. That was definitely their heaviest one. Probably, once again, Jake, maybe bordering on post-metal.
Right.
And Vaughn from Sigur Rós, it's an interesting debut. It borders more on shoegaze, and you can tell that at the time they didn't really know how to incorporate Jónsi's vocals.
Yeah.
He actually had said, like, the reason he sang is just because no one else could, so it was one of those situations where he's like, I don't know, man, I guess I'll sing, and so they had him sing, which in hindsight was, like, the best idea ever, because he's freaking awesome, but at the time, he was just trying to step up, and you could tell on their debut that he hadn't really quite gotten his chops down.
Yeah, that album certainly centered more around this ambience and more of just the atmosphere of the sound. You don't hear a lot of that legendary cathartic the melody and the big builds that you're so used to if you've listened to more recent Sigur Rós albums. And, without that being present, it doesn't really have the same effect, right? Like, it's kind of cool to go back and listen to Vaughn to understand where these guys come from, but it's just not that great of an album, I don't think.
I totally agree.
It's interesting, but it's not impactful.
And from that standpoint, I think that Godspeed and Mogwai had much stronger debuts.
I would totally agree with that.
F sharp, A sharp, Infinity, to me, that might as well be a soundtrack, which you can really say about most of Godspeed's stuff. Godspeed You Black Emperor is a post-rock band that they, I don't want to say rely on, that's not right, but they use more samples of people talking, interviews, clips from things like that. And that kind of provides a mood and some kind of narrative context to their work while they play along in the background. It gives it a very unique feel and really allows the instrumentals to serve a different purpose. But these songs, they go through various movements with very little to no structure and even a lot of silence in between. These long stretches of these like ambience and minimalistic tendencies really make the guitar shine even more when they do come in. So that's what I love about Godspeed. That's really their trademark to me. And I think that they do that pretty well on their debut, but it's not one of my more favorite albums of theirs.
So moving on from there, in 1998, you have Tom's favorite Tortoise album, TNT, which, Tom, I mean, how would you describe TNT? Is it dynamite?
Now we're getting back to AC/DC. I only mentioned them real quick earlier. I didn't want to actually talk about them. No,
AC/DC deep dive next week.
Oh, God. Next week? What? I'm going to have to listen to so much AC/DC? Don't make me do it.
I wouldn't make it to next week. I wouldn't make it.
Fair enough. Yeah, TNT, the thing that I think is really neat about this is we talked about electronic components being introduced into the sound, right? This is where you start to hear more of that come through. Tortoise have established themselves on their first couple albums as really being a little bit more guitar and beat focused. Millions Now Living Will Never Die has more groove to it, like in that first track I talked about that's really long, DJ'd. But TNT, I feel like, is really the best of both worlds when it comes to their first two albums, because I think that what I really like about their 1994 debut is that first off, it came out in 1994, so of course I'm going to like it.
Yeah, that's the greatest year in music.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Right? Yeah, absolutely.
We need to do a podcast just on 1994.
We really should, but it would be like the longest thing ever, because here's the 500 great albums that came out that year.
It's just Rolling Stones top 500.
Right. So the thing I like about TNT is it takes from their debut more of the structure, more of the open-ended structure with some shorter track lengths, but still quite a few tracks that are able to develop. But it really perfects their production. I feel like Tortoise's debut had kind of rough production. It got noisy and a little bit harsh at times, and it really affected the clarity of what they were doing. On Millions Now Living Will Never Die, God, that's a mouthful. On that album, they have some great ideas, but they don't have the time to draw them out and really expand on them. They have that first track, and then they have a few tracks after that don't really offer a whole lot of variety, I feel like. But on TNT, they take the best of those. They take that clean, kind of electronic, kind of groovy sound, and they stretch it out a bit longer into songs that are a little bit more appealing to me. But I will say, Tortoise is always one of those bands that leans more towards the low dynamic side of post-rock. And I don't think that's going to attract a lot of people. It's more of kind of a chill groove than it is an intense build like you get from Explosions in the Sky or Godspeed.
A few weeks later, after TNT came out in 1999, at the end of March, you have Mogwai's second record, Come On Die Young.
Yeah.
Interesting shift, really, for them.
It is, because Young Team was so intense and had so many heavy moments, and then Come On Die Young, it got really mixed reviews because I think people weren't ready for this shift that they took, because it's much more sedated than their debut, and especially considering the heavy moments of Young Team, those were the highlights for me, and they largely abandoned that. They're taking the context out of it, I still think this is a really great album. The riffs are good, the mood is really acute. I would just say, since they don't incorporate quite as much of the dynamic contrast or instrumental variety, that 67-minute runtime is a little unjustified on Come On Die Young. But what it comes down to is the songs are still good, and I feel like the ideas are still there. So I think that gets kind of a bad rep, but it's really still a pretty well done album.
Okay, and later in 1999, about halfway through in June, we have Sigur Ros's second album, and I'm going to kill the pronunciation, but I'm going to go for it, Tom.
Go it.
Agitus Burian.
I couldn't do it better, man. Agitus Burian.
Agitus Burian. So we're going to go with that. It's probably wrong, but, we do our best. This album, to me, really marks the end of early post-rock and the beginning. It's kind of that album that's right centered in between the two eras. It really kind of defined and cemented what the post-rock sound is at that point. It had kind of been forming, right? Like through the ether, you see all these different sounds, and the label got applied to Bark Psychosis's Hex. You have Tortoise and Mogwai really starting to put out a couple really seminal post-rock releases, and a few other bands in there as well. And then now Sigur Rós drops their second record, where they had Vaughn before, which was more of that ambient kind of sprawling atmospheric sound, and then now you have like the first true full-fledged post-rock record, full-fledged Sigur Rós record as well. That is what you think of when you think of Sigur Rós. Yeah. How else would you describe Agitus Burian?
It's a masterpiece.
It is a masterpiece.
It is absolutely amazing, and it came out on my 10th birthday.
Ooh.
If you think that's a coincidence, you're right. Because I had nothing to do with it. But I'll still take that one.
No. Would you give it a 10?
I'd give it damn close, man. Yeah. I'd probably need to spend a little more time with it.
Out of 100. Huh?
Oh my God. Yes, lower than Bieber.
That's not possible.
That's right. No. The thing that I think makes this album perfect, if not damn near perfect, if not perfect, I would say, is that it is truly the perfect cross section of albumization and album strength and track highlights.
Absolutely.
Every single song on here is a freaking killer track.
Yes, I'm not going to attempt to pronounce them, but the first two actual tracks on the album, which mark like the first 20 minutes, 22 minutes of music, 20 minutes, 16, 18, somewhere in there. Some large amount of music that you hear. Tracks 2 and tracks 3, the S tracks. Those have that typical post-rock Sigur Rós vibe that comes to my mind when I hear that band. I hear a lot of, Jónsi's iconic cathartic vocal melodies. And it just sticks with you when you hear those songs. Those songs will stick in your head and they go to your soul right away, but then they kind of shift, and the next two tracks are a little bit darker, a little bit quieter, but do introduce more huge dynamic shifts, and it's just such a crazy attack on your senses when you're listening to this record. Every single track on this record, Tom, as you said, is stellar.
And I don't know what Jónsi spent 1998 doing to get his voice to where it was for that album, but it's perfect. And it plays the perfect role in supporting the instrumentals, because he's really just using it as another instrument to create a little bit of extra melody, to reverb the hell out of it. It's just one of those albums that came together so beautifully that you don't even know how someone planned it.
Sure.
Like it just works out great. And I think a lot of people would probably argue that is, possibly the greatest post-rock album. And I probably wouldn't argue with them.
I'm one of those people.
That's a difficult argument to make, really, against that. So moving from 1999 into 2000, this is where we see the introduction of a new fledgling band called Explosions in the Sky. Early in 2000, they had their debut, How Strange Innocence.
Aptly titled.
Yes, which I feel like I'd actually put on a similar level as Siguros's debut.
Sure.
It's very underdeveloped. You can tell the ideas they're going for, but they're just not executed quite as well. The production isn't really helping matters.
No,
things
not
are
at all.
washed together. They're kind of muddy and not very...
Yep. Doesn't do them any
not mixed
favors.
well. No, it really doesn't. And I think they just didn't really know how to play as a band together yet. But you can tell right from the get-go, they knew the mood they wanted to go. They wanted to achieve.
Yep, and that's really what Explosions is all about: is creating that mood. And so you saw kind of the early foundations of their sound forming, but it wasn't all composed yet. It wasn't polished. It wasn't chiseled into place like you hear in their later records.
Then a little later in the fall, I want to mention an album that I'd never heard before this podcast, and that's Pele's The Nudes. This one, it's very clean post-rock, maybe more along the lines of Tortoise, I would say, and in the fact that it's just got kind of a nice moving groove to it. It actually reminds me of like if you took Dodos and removed the vocals.
That's a good call.
That's an album that gets often overlooked. But then, about just the month after Pele's The Nudes, there's an album that we gotta take a quick tangent and mention, because we can't have a podcast and not mention this album, and that's Radiohead's Kid A.
Oh yeah, that came out in 2000, didn't it?
It sure did.
Yeah,
right there in October 2000, and a lot of folks have discussed Kid A's impact on the post-rock genre. And this is something I want to make sure we address as well, because I think we'd just be missing a chapter of the story if we didn't, Jake. And that's, the fact that we're in 2000, Kid A comes out. It's a huge change. We talked on our Radiohead podcast about the influence that had, but I want to talk about how it relates to the post-rock genre, because some people would consider Kid A to be a post-rock album. I think that's a little far. I think it's got hints of it, but it's doing way too much with vocals, and I think it's doing way too much with just electronica to really be post-rock. But there are moments, especially you take track 5, Tree Fingers, which is an all-guitar kind of ambient effects-driven work. Sure, like that makes perfect sense. But I think that Kid A had less of an impact on the post-rock genre as the post-rock genre had an impact on Kid A.
I think you could make just as big of an argument that albums like OK Computer or a lot or even going back to like mid-90s indie rock like Pavement played on post-rock. Yes, completely different moods and styles, but if you think about like what those albums and bands did for guitar and how you play guitar and create ambiance with guitar, I think is just as big. And obviously Radiohead in Kid A did that same thing as well. They built off of, whether fans choose to acknowledge it or not, they built off of what they had achieved on OK Computer with all of the ambiance and the guitars, and really took it to another level. It was just a different direction, right?
Yeah, that's absolutely right.
And the same thing can be applied to a lot of these post-rock bands that we hear today, is that they're using guitars in ways that other rock bands just simply didn't do to create mood, to create ambiance, and to create a sound that really attacks your senses from multiple angles.
And I think that they did more for the popularity of it, probably, than even just the musical influence, because people were already kind of doing that stuff. But once Radiohead opens up a door, then it becomes a marketable thing, and then people can justify their musical choices saying, well, hey, shit, I mean, Radiohead did it, so why can't we do it? And then record labels start to take more notice, and the mainstream audience starts to take more notice. Sure. And I think that really opens doors up. Yep. You need some like key bands, some flagship artists to to carry that torch and to move things along that way. And I think that Radiohead helped do that with Kid A.
Yep. These few years in here, from 1999 kind of to 2004, 2005, that's what I kind of see as like the golden age of post-rock. Not that it's over, but that's kind of like there was a lot of just very key albums that were released here. Mm-hmm. Godspeed You Black Emperors, Lift Your Skinny Fists Like Antennas to Heaven. To me, that is one of the greatest post-rock records. Mogwai's Rock Action, Explosions in the Sky, second record, Those Who Tell the Truth Shall Die, Those Who Tell the Truth Shall Live Forever. And then you had Sigur Ros's Untitled, Mogwai's Happy Songs for Happy People. Just a lot of just very impactful.
It just keeps going.
Yeah, it really does. There Explosions in the Sky in 2003. The Earth Is Not a Cold Dead Place.
That's a big one.
That's actually the first post-rock album I ever listened to.
Earlier in 2001, you had Set Fire to Flames, Sings Rain Rebuilder, which is a very brooding post-rock album. If you're a Godspeed fan, I'd recommend checking that one out. It's even a little more out there than Godspeed is, but along the same lines. But yeah, we start to see this evolve a little bit more. But this is where bands, I think, start to branch even more distinctly in their own directions and create their own identity. You know, Mogwai on Rock Action in 2001, all of a sudden they start incorporating more vocals. And personally, I actually don't think that was a great move for them.
No.
I think Mogwai's vocals didn't really serve the music as well. You know, when I listen to Rock Action, I always get excited like, oh, a Mogwai album that's like under 40 minutes. It's actually digestible. But then I don't feel like they fill it with much. And they have the vocals in there that I'm not a big fan of. But at the same time, then Sigur Rós had their Untitled album, which is a little more minimalistic, but also is really, really damn good. I mean, they just kept evolving their sound. From there, we also had Do Make Say Think, who we had seen a little bit earlier with their debut, but in 2003 they had Winter Hymn, Country Hymn, Secret Hymn, a band that if you like Explosions in the Sky, you're probably going to like them.
And I loved this record. I really, really enjoyed listening to this. It had that emotional conveyance, which reminded me of Explosions. Mm-hmm. You have to feel it to get the full experience. Beginning around 2005 is where you start to see, you know, a lot of these of the big name bands that we've been discussing throughout this timeline of post-rock. These big name post-rock acts have made a lot of their foundational post-rock albums, and in Mogwai and Tortoise's case, they've released several just seminal records in the post-rock genre. But Explosions in the Sky, Sigur Rós, you know, a few of the other bands that we mentioned earlier, even other some of the smaller bands like Do Make Say Think and Don Caballero have released these like big name albums. Mm-hmm. Around 2005 is where it really, I think, starts to split more precipitously. And kind of playing off of the other influences, a big, you know, Radiohead's Kid A and things like that kind of influence this genre. You start to see, you know, as these bands who are naturally trying to define a sound that is inherently artistic and new and original and emotive, and all of these fresh and appealing sounds to a certain, certain style of audience, right? The certain music listener who wants something deeper out of music. They have to constantly be reaching and experimenting and trying to go somewhere else. Well, right around this time, you see a lot of these artists start to either, they really follow, from what I can tell, they follow two paths. They either start pushing the genre in new directions, new evolutions, And that's where I think like post rock or post metal really starts kicking off kind of in the mid 2000s. And I want to take a minute to go down that tangent, because you either have bands that are kind of pushing against the now established post-rock sound, or you have bands like Explosions in the Sky who just stay cemented in the post-rock sound that they've established for themselves, and they just keep churning out great album after great album. I put Sigur Rós into that brand as well. Mogwai, I think, experiments a little bit here and there, but nothing drastic, right? They're still kind of in their own sound silo. But you hear other new artists as the new artists come out, because I think that you now have these like post-rock titans that have defined, not only have some of them have even participated in the founding of post-rock, but they've made these just huge albums that have defined now in the mental image in your head of these bands and what they sound like. They defined what post-rock is. The newer artists are trying to find their own niche, right? So how they do that is by experimentation. So I think that's what drives the early foundations of post-metal. Now, this isn't a post-metal podcast, but we do just want to note some of the major post-rock acts.
Sure. Yeah, you have to acknowledge those, because they're starting to carry the torch in a different direction. That's commendable. But a lot of bands that Jake, you and I have even had the opportunity to review albums from. Some of my favorites being Russian Circles, Animals as Leaders, Pelican. In particular, Russian Circles, man. I can't get enough of that band. Impros and Memorial. Their latest two albums have both been absolutely stellar. We also have like Red Sparrows, Jesu, Isis, great bands. Animals as Leader, a little bit more technical, a little bit more prog, but just heavy as shit. Really, that's what separates these bands, right? And I think that's worth mentioning, is where do we draw that line between post-metal and post-rock? Well, it's as hard a line to draw as it is between regular rock and regular metal. You know, where do you consider something to be heavy enough to be considered post-metal or even regular metal? And I think the big thing for me there is just going to be, how do you spend a majority of your time as a band? And what space do you occupy most of the time? Because you can certainly say that there are moments where Explosions in the Sky gets kind of metal, gets kind of droney, gets kind of sludgy and heavy, right? But there is more time where Explosions in the Sky is beautiful and twinkly and all of those things. And it's that contrast that makes those heavy moments so memorable. But then you have a band like Russian Circles, for example, that they have post-rock moments where it's softer, but they spend more time really being heavy and intense, turning on all their distortion pedals and just rocking the hell out. It's a little less focused on the reverb and a little bit more focused on the layers of distortion and the faster, more technical rhythms rather than just the slow builds. That's how I would differentiate it. But it's still a very fine line, and it's a tough distinction to make.
So in 2005, a couple notable releases happened. I'd say Sigur Rós' album Tak, which came out in September of 2005. Another just huge release for Sigur Rós. You also have Saxon Shore's The Exquisite Death of Saxon Shore, which I don't believe was their first record.
No, they had come out with some EPs before that as well, yeah. They'd been around.
But Tom, I know that's your favorite post-rock record.
It is my favorite post-rock record. And I'll say, some of that is for personal, sentimental reasons, because that was really one of the first post-rock albums I really listened to a lot. And I actually, when we were preparing for this, Jake, I went back to that album closer to the end when I had listened to like everything else through once or twice. And I thought, I wonder if this will still hold that title as my favorite post-rock album, because I've listened to a lot of tremendous post-rock now. And
Agitesburian.
Yeah, exactly. Which I still acknowledge as artistically a better album, but when it comes down to it, The Exquisite Death of Saxon Shore is the perfect album for me, because it just suits everything that I'm looking for in a musical experience. While the production isn't as tactful, the arrangements aren't as brilliant as albums like Agitesburian or Lift Your Skinny Fists, for example. For me, Exquisite Death really provides like the perfect balance of both a complete listening experience and consistent track-by-track success. That's also what I said about Sigur Ros's album. But what I love is that each track has its own strong identity. It's able to strike an emotional connection in a short amount of time, which is just very efficient. I love that in a band. But there is a focus on melody there that I think a lot of post-rock is missing. The guitars in Saxon Shore are melodic and at times even catchy. They're still not relying on like a verse-chorus kind of structure. They have some great building tracks, but I find myself wanting to come back to those tracks more specifically than really any other post-rock album.
In 2007, you have my favorite post-rock record release, and that's Explosions in the Sky, All of a Sudden I Miss Everyone. This is, I think, most Explosions in the Sky fans, this is usually their favorite Explosions record. Of course, there's probably some of you out there who would disagree
Earth is Not a Cold Dead Place is up there too.
That's usually the second pick, if not the first. So that record to me, as I said, The Earth is Not a Cold Dead Place is the first album that I got into in post rock, and obviously by Explosions in the Sky. And then this record was really the one that cemented my love for this band and in the genre in general. We've seen them play live several times now, Tom, and they always play several tracks from this record.
Yeah,
and it's for good reason.
Great.
This is just a masterpiece. You also, in 2007, have Caspian's The Four Trees. Caspian, this I honestly had not listened to The Four Trees prior to this podcast, but I actually think that I like it better than their 2011 record that we reviewed, 2012 record that we reviewed, Waking Season.
Really?
Which we loved.
Yeah, because I love both of those albums.
Yeah, I mean, they're both just fantastic.
I feel like Four Trees is a little bit held back by the production. It's not quite as clean,
yeah,
but it depends on what you're listening to it on, and it's still just the writing is superb, and there's so much potential. Well, not even just potential, because the thing's goddamn good in itself. I mean, but I think they only go on and make even better things. I don't know why I don't hear about this band more. I think they've got to be the most underappreciated band in post-rock.
They really do.
Because they have yet to do anything bad. I think everything they've done is just great.
And then, obviously, Mogwai's releasing albums throughout this time. Yep. They have The Hawk is Howling in 2008. From Monument to Masses, an album we reviewed early on little-known frequencies. We went back and listened to that together recently.
Still great.
It's still fantastic. And then Explosions in the Skies, Take Care, Take Care, Take Care came out in 2011. We got to experience that while reviewing music, and they released The Wilderness earlier this year. So they're still making great music.
Well, that's the interesting thing about this genre is a lot of the key players from the early days are still making music. We saw Tortoise and Mogwai release albums this year already as well. We saw Godspeed release like last year, I think. I mean, they're still around, and the evolution has been really interesting from that standpoint. Some bands I like more than others. I think we can both agree, Jake. Bands like Sigur Rós and Explosions in the Sky have been a little bit more consistent in quality. Mogwai, I for one, really like their first two albums with Rock Action, Mr. Beast, and Happy Songs for Happy People. I feel like they strayed a little bit, but they really helped define the genre when it came to starting to incorporate more electronic textures in like the mid-2000s. With Hawk is Howling in 2008, I actually think that was the best thing they'd put out since their first couple.
Yep.
Really strong album. They bring the intensity back up. So even within these little niche corners of the genre that these bands are creating for themselves, they're finding ways to explore. And I think that's really neat when you have a genre that doesn't rely on vocals to bring the unique nuances out in the music.
Right. So, Tom, if you had to take a guess, where would you say post-rock is going as a genre? And that's kind of obviously it's a challenging, loaded question because we don't know the answer to it. And B, I think that the derivations of post-rock are really going to define where the genre is going, because that kind of speaks for itself. I think post-metal is still in its infancy.
Yeah, I think so too.
I think we're going to see that genre really grow over the next few years, and that's something I'm really excited about. Because if you think about like the early 90s, the bands, the early post-rock bands, the founding bands there, no one would tell you at that time that, oh yeah, this genre is going to be huge and there's going to be all sorts of defining albums. But I think post-metal is on the rise, right? Like you keep getting these quality releases, and more bands are kind of flirting with this sound, especially a lot of metal bands, because I think the screamo trope is getting very tired.
Well, and a lot of people just flat out don't like it. How many people do you talk to that you try to get turned on to metal and they're like, yeah, this is good, but I don't like the vocals,
I fell into that category at one time.
Oh, yeah, and because metal vocals are very polarizing. Right. And I think in a lot of ways, instrumental metal actually lends itself to a wider audience. In some ways, because there's still people out there who are like, what? There's rock music with no vocals?
Right. If you think about like Deaf Heaven, you and I are huge Deaf Heaven fans, and if you think about like a lot of the things that we described about post rock would apply to Deaf Heaven. Yeah. They're very longer songs, more progressive in structure, mixing a lot of influences and very rock centric sound. The vocalist is while there is vocals, the vocals are more for texture and used as an instrument. They're mixed a little bit lower in the mix, so they don't sit on top, and they definitely don't provide a lot of melody. Yeah. So you could even see how bands are starting to flirt with these ideas that really favor the post-metal sound. So I really think that genre is going to just bloom and explode over the next few years.
I could see that. Within post-rock, I think it's going to continue to become more electronic. We're seeing that from bands like Tortoise and Mogwai. They're embracing that. They're finding ways to use it. But I really think that the factors of just guitar, bass, and drums, I think people are starting to think that they're reaching the edges of what they can do with that. And so I think that will continue to be used in different ways. Right. There are even a lot of bands that we listened to in preparation for this podcast, Jake, that we didn't talk about. Bands like Hood and Mice Parade and Efterklang that I listened to because I did some searches and they came up as post-rock, but I would have trouble classifying them as post-rock because it's a lot of subtle, glitchy electronica that, in my opinion, relies too much on vocals and not enough on a rock sound to be considered really in the rock genre at all. But I think it's worth noting also some other things that we might have left off the list, Jake, that some people do consider to be post-rock. Sure. One notable one being Swans. Yeah. I think we're going to get roasted for not including Swans in this, which is a band that we love. And they've even just released an album that we'll talk about in our June wrap-up that's freaking great. I mean, they've been on a roll, but I listen to them.
Are you saying the June wrap-up is going to be great, or are you saying that the new Swans record is great?
The new Swans record is great. Okay. It absolutely is.
Well, I hope the June wrap-up's okay.
I hope it turns out okay. I can't tell the future. Yeah. I mean, we might just absolutely bomb it.
First track on your new album.
There you go. I don't know. I don't consider Swans to be post-rock. I never would have thought of them as post-rock if someone hadn't brought it up to me. So it got me thinking, and I just feel like there's too much of a reliance on vocals. I don't think that certainly they're using guitar and they have a lot of big builds and stuff like that, but in a lot of ways, I guess I just never really thought of it as post-rock. To me, it doesn't feel like that.
Sure.
Maybe in some ways closer to post-metal, but they've also been around since like the 80s. So they've been,
or post-punk at times too.
Post-punk, absolutely.
Like they just don't seem to occupy the same space in my head. I just can't make sense of it. Yeah. But I guess I can kind of see how someone would connect the two. I think to close this dive into the post-rock genre, we should talk about what our top 5 favorite post-rock albums are. Now it's not, none of these are going to be a surprise if you've listened to our description, to the timeline of which albums are showing up here. But just at a high level, who they are from and what they did for us personally. Mm-hmm. This is a favorites list, not a best list, I'd say. So to start with, number 5, Caspian's Waking Season, came out in 2012. Now, I just made the statement that I kind of like
Four Trees.
The Four Trees a little bit more than Waking Season, but that's probably just because I'm diving into that one really heavy recently.
Sure.
But Waking Season was an album that, to me, as you alluded to earlier, Tom, criminally underrated.
Yeah.
It just, the dynamic contrast and the cathartic releases of the instrumental palette in the songwriting in this album are just mind-blowing. And this was an album to me that kind of showed the depth of post-rock. When it came out in 2012, I had some exposure to post-rock. I've been listening to some of the bigger names in post-rock for years. And, Waking Season really for me kind of started getting me answering the question in my head, where is post-rock going? And I think Caspian is one of the bands that are going to take us there. And so that's why I think that album is important and has to be on VIM's favorite post-rock album list.
At number 4 is the monumental Godspeed You Black Emperors, Lift Your Skinny Fists Like Antenna to Heaven. Wow. A tremendously long album. It's comprised of 4 like 20 plus minute tracks or something. Just a huge album, but man, they go everywhere and they do everything. They have the big instrumental builds, focus on guitar, drums. Everything is so deliberate. There's nothing accidental about this. The samples that they're using to convey their emotion and tell their story with the instrumentals, I mean, these guys just have it mastered.
At number 3, and really number 2 and 3, I gotta say they're tied.
Yeah.
Because I feel like you and I both love both these records.
Yep.
So they're our favorite records. So tied at 2 and 3, you have Saxon Shore's The Exquisite Death of Saxon Shore, which came out in 2005. And then you have 2007's Explosions in the Sky, All of a Sudden I Miss Everyone.
Yeah.
The former is Tom's favorite post-rock record. The latter is my favorite post-rock record. We just talked about these. Just fantastic demonstrations of different types of post-rock. The Saxon Shore is so melodic. You really have a lot of, honestly, they bring in a lot of even subtle electronic elements that really help build the sound.
Gives the sound a little bit sharper of an edge, a little more
it's
high
brighter.
End. Yeah.
Which adds a whole nother emotional dynamic to the mix, which is a really interesting tactic and just gives a credit to Saxon Shore's songwriting. All of a Sudden I Miss Everyone, Explosions in the Sky, just demonstrating how devastatingly emotional they can be at times and convey that through just walls of shimmering guitar, and contrast that with just the absolute pianissimo, just desolate sounds of that they just pull everything back, and then all you hear is like the quietest piano or the quietest guitar strumming.
One thing I love about that album is the closing track.
Oh, absolutely.
It's actually like the most uplifting part of the album. Yep. They end on that kind of optimistic note, and it just kills me.
So number 1, Tom?
Yeah. Algitis Burian.
By Sigur Rós.
If I said it right, yeah.
To me, that's the perfect post-rock record.
It is. There's nothing bad to be said about it. I see it being one of those that's really up there for me as I listen to it more. And I listened to it several times before preparing for this podcast, but for some reason it just never really struck me as much as when I listened to it in the context of all these other post-rock records. Because that's really how it shines. It's such a singular album that I think will really stand the test of time. Also, if you look in the description, if you're watching this on YouTube or if you downloaded the podcast, in the description also, there should be a link to a Spotify playlist where we will now begin providing you with all the samples that you hear in this podcast. You can go to that Spotify playlist and listen to. So we'll have that one for the post-rock deep dive here, so that if you want to listen to the bands that we've talked about, you can just go to that playlist, listen through it. You'll hear all the things that we're talking about. I mean, for this post-rock one, it's probably going to be like the longest playlist ever, but it's going to be great.
Well, Tom, I think we've talked post-rock to death.
I think we have.
And that's our job on this podcast. We talk about music until we're blue in the face.
Yep.
And I am very blue. Next week, not next week, but in a couple weeks, we'll release our next podcast, which will be the June 2016 new album wrap up. And as Tom alluded to earlier, there's a quasi post rock band release in that already, with Swans releasing their new record. And I'm sure it's 2 hours long, right, Tom?
Oh, yeah.
I haven't listened to it yet.
No,
so.
It is 2 hours long.
Oh, that's great.
Absolutely.
That's great. I can't wait to devote 2 hours. Actually, I'm being sarcastic, but it probably will be awesome.
It is awesome. I listened to it. It's awesome.
Yeah. I remember the last Swans album that came out, I had to listen to, I would listen to it when I mowed, and I would, I wouldn't even get half my yard done, or I wouldn't even get half the album done by the time I got my yard
because you're like,
mowed.
hey, I could listen to this one Swan song or any Ramones album. That's
the truth.
You could weigh those on the balance. And,
right.
Yeah.
So lots of new albums coming out right now. We're in that hot season of the year where bands are just dropping albums left and right. So I'm sure we'll have a ton of music to get through in the next couple weeks. Hopefully you guys are checking out some of the new albums that are coming out and are willing and able to participate with us as we dive into new music in our next podcast. Backing up to the post-rock deep dive, what are your guys' favorite post-rock records? What are the big albums that really woke you up to this kind of hidden gem of a genre? We'd love to hear your thoughts on this genre and your favorite post-rock albums. Thank you guys for your continued support and participation. Tom and I love all of your comments on our YouTube videos, Facebook messages, and emails that you send us. Your participation is what makes Velocities in Music possible. So as always, thank you for being awesome. I'm Jake.
I'm Tom.
We are Velocities in Music, moving music discussion forward.